Well, we're here at the end of the year, and it's time to make our picks for the best games of 2022 and ultimately our game of the year. Matthew, you excited about this?
I am. This is the Nintendo Watcher second annual Game of the Year awards, right? We're doing a little different this year. We're laying some ground rules as we always do, sticking with games that are playable on Nintendo consoles exclusively. So we won't be talking about our personal top tens of the year outside of Nintendo platforms, though we do have others that would have made the list had that been the case. We have a couple rules though this year, right, Justin? There's one
That's
in
right.
particular, right, that we added because this was, I think we've talked about this a lot on the pod this year, a banner year for remakes and remasters. In particular, JRPGs, Square Enix saw a ton of their classics remastered, as well as a few other companies releasing some cool ports and remakes. And we debated quite a bit throwing some of those on the list, but ultimately decided that these would only be fresh games. We've got a top 10 list this year. We've done it in the past. We've done categories, best soundtrack, best narrative design, best RPG action game, whatever. This year, Justin and I wrote two individual top 10 lists. We compared our lists and then we discussed where would we whittle this down to 10 games released on Nintendo Switch this year that were the must-have, must-play experiences of a year that was stacked with content. Again, if this were, if this were a top 10 list outside of just Nintendo hardware, we would have absolutely been stumped on where to place most of this. It helped that we
Yeah.
were able to narrow it to, new releases from 2022 on the Nintendo Switch. That was helpful. It was not enough for both of us to be completely satisfied with the final 10, but we do think that we've come with something that works, that is representative of what came out this year and what experiences were most enjoyable and valuable for your time and money. And so this is, without any further ado, the Nintendo Watcher 2022 Game of the Year Awards, with number 10 going to a rather controversial pick, I think, in Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. Justin, how did this land at our number 10?
Well, for a long time, it was number 12 or 13. I think
Mm-hmm.
this was probably the one that caused us the most grief in building the list. You
Yes.
know, I think whenever you and I talked about it, and even whenever we had the podcast about it with Jeremy, we weren't sure that this would make a top 10 list. A Pokemon game, a mainline Pokemon game, not making a top 10 list at the end of the year, that seems crazy. But with the way that this particular game launched, it was tough. This is easily, to give it credit and why it's on the list, it's easily Game Freak's most ambitious game to date.
Yeah.
They are trying to do things with this game that I think we have to encourage them. you
Yes.
know but the way that the game shipped, it sold a bazillion copies, but the way that the game shipped was just, uh, it's unjustifiable. There's so many drawbacks to the game. They took way too many concessions to have it out, I think, in the same year as Arceus, and that was
Mm-hmm.
part of the issue.
Yeah.
I think that it's the weakest of the mainline Pokemon games on the Switch, but even saying that, it's still a solid game. It's a solid Pokemon
I
game.
couldn't put it down.
Um,
I couldn't put it down.
I,
That I
yeah,
think is ultimately where it made the list. Is I looked back at my year of playing Nintendo Switch, and despite my gripes, despite my complaints about the performance, despite the fact that it takes some swings that do not connect, I played that game from start to finish, including post game content, in a week and a half. I couldn't put the game down. I spent more time in Pokemon Violet than I did in just about any other game on this list, with two exceptions. And that, I think, says something about the experience. Yes, was it worth the price they were charging for the performance that they offered? I don't think so. I think this is a wait for sale Pokemon game, which is not something I typically would say. But unless they get the performance hammered out, which they have not yet, it's just not worth the $60 necessarily. That being said, I don't regret having spent the $60. And I loved the game. I played enough hours into it that it would be disingenuous, I think, for us not to at least put it at number 10 on the Nintendo Watcher Game of the Year list. Does that seem fair?
Yeah, just barely makes it in, but the let's talk about some of the pros really quick before we move on. Giving us options for branching paths, the huge open
Mm-hmm.
world, getting out of individual zones that we had in Arceus, and just a really weird breakdown of the map in Sword and Shield, where you had huge wild areas and then other really structured routes. Anyway,
Mm-hmm.
all of that was really good. The Pokemon designs, I think you've mentioned
Yes,
this too. The Pokemon
that's
designs
fun.
were really top notch this time. So
My favorite
despite all the
generation design
drawbacks,
wise. Yeah.
wow, ever or just
In
recent?
recent memory, since the original, right? Obviously, I think that Gen One takes the cake, right? As far as I'm concerned, but in recent gens, this is the best design in a number of years, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, no, I agree with you there. All right. So that barely squeaks in at number 10. Number 9, Kirby and the Forgotten Land.
Yeah,
This one was a big surprise for me too. I went mouthful mode for it.
yeah. Oh man, I could not get enough. I mean, so you picked up this game a couple, I think a month before I got around to it. Played it. I know that it took a little while for it to stick. I think for both of us,
Hmm.
but this was a just kind of like one of those experiences where I didn't expect to go in really loving it. I'm usually a fan of Kirby games, but I don't typically complete them because I find them to be a little too simplistic, a little too, repetitive, that I get to the point where 3 or 4 worlds in, I'm burnt out, right? I've seen it. I
Yep.
know what it's got to offer. This game continually surprises, right? I mean, the traditional power-ups, there's fewer than in previous games, which is a bummer, but you combine that with the mouthful mode powers, which is a really fun new mechanic. You already mentioned, it is the defining characteristic of this game. You suck up objects, and in very un-Kirby fashion, they get lodged in his throat. He takes on the form of whatever he's ingested, and imbibes their powers in that way. So he becomes a car. He actually becomes a car. It's stuck in his mouth, and you can see it sticking out the bottom, right, as you drive through little race courses or whatever. But what I found really interesting is this game kept faking me out on when it was going to end. I get to the end of a set of worlds, and I thought, okay, well, we're King DDD. This is it, right? We're about to win. We're gonna rescue the last of the Waddle Dees, and that'll be the end of it. And then we're in a whole nother map with a whole new set of worlds, and it just kept going and kept going and kept getting harder and more interesting and more mechanically rich and more enjoyable to experience. Some of the arena battles in this game are bonkers.
Yeah.
Again, it just does everything right. It feels good to play. It's not hard necessarily, but it feels good to play, and it does Kirby well. It's a joy to look at. I mean, what are your thoughts on this game? I know, again, I think you had some takes at the beginning. I don't know how much that's changed since you played more of it, but I'd love to hear why it ended at number 9 for you.
Yeah, I think that the first few levels had a lot of that traditional Kirby stuff, even though you had some new features and you're moving in 3D. But the first few levels did feel a little samey, like
Yeah.
okay, well, I've got the same power up, I'm fighting a lot of the same enemies. This is kind of boring. But you're right. The further you get along, you're outside of those almost tutorial stages. And once you get past those, the game really opens up. So controlling Kirby in a 3D environment, I thought was really, really cool. The power ups, they were a little boring in some
Yeah.
places, but that's fine. Like you were able. There were few enough of them that you were really able to learn to use them well.
Mm-hmm.
But the biggest upside for this game for me was not only the time that it came out, because it came out during kind of a dry spell towards the
Yeah.
beginning of the year, if you remember that.
Yeah.
But the biggest thing for this game for me was it scratched that collectible itch for me.
Mm-hmm.
Secrets hidden all around these stages. You know, you're trying to find uh, treasure. You're trying to save the little
The
Kirby
Waddle
things.
Dees.
What are they called? The Waddle
Waddle
Dees. You're
Dees.
trying to save all the Waddle Dees, and they're hidden in some really clever places, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You have to have certain power ups to be able to get to them. I thought that was really awesome, and
Yeah.
I love 3D platformers, so this really scratched that itch for me.
Yeah, a lot of replayability in the stages as a result, which again I think was a big boon for it, and that's what lands it at number 9. You know, just a good experience that both of us had a fun time with. Didn't expect to enjoy as much as we did, and doesn't do anything wrong. I don't think. You know, again, it's not the most interesting or enjoyable experience as far as like or challenging experience, I should say, but it's pure enjoyment from start to finish, and that lands it at number 9, which is a very similar approach that I feel is what lands number 8 at number 8, which is Shredder's Revenge, the most recent Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles beat 'em up. Now, we talked about the Cowabunga collection, 13 Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle games all bundled into one, and yet, despite that amazing collection of some really classic, good and terrible Ninja Turtles games, this is far and away, in my opinion, including I'm even talking the classic Nintendo, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles arcade game. This is the best Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle games they've ever released. Thoughts, Justin?
Totally agree. You and I went to a barcade earlier this year and played Turtles in Time. And I remember thinking, wow, this game is great. And then we played Shredder's Revenge together, and Shredder's Revenge just blew it away.
Yeah.
It's a love letter to those classic games, but
Mm-hmm.
it's updated, in such a way that it makes sense with a modern controller. It makes
Yeah.
sense to play online. It makes sense for couch co-op. One of my favorite memories from this year is playing this game with you and a couple of our other friends on the 4th of
Mm-hmm.
July,
Yeah.
and it was the perfect pick up and play game. You didn't have to know the controls to jump into it. We all just sat there for a couple of hours and went through the entire game, and that's like an old school kind of couch co-op memory that I didn't think I would have anymore. A game
Yeah.
that everybody could jump into and everybody would appreciate and like and actually finish.
Yeah. I mean, and so Shredder's Revenge, short game, do it in a sitting. It's mechanically simplistic if you want to. You can get through pretty much the whole game taunting and using specials, because you taunt in the game, you build special gauge, 2 taunts, you got a special, you unleash a special, you knock out all the enemies on the screen pretty much. You can also dive really deep into the leveling system, level up a particular turtle, or April O'Neil in my case, unlock a plethora of interesting and deep combos that allow you to really do some stuff with a traditional side-scrolling beat 'em up that you don't typically see with deep combo systems, really useful special moves, some fun team up powers, and a really nice like dodge and dash and slide mechanic that I thought was really cool. The game allows you to play it how you want to play it, and it is again very easy if you want it to be, but you can pump up the difficulty, make it a lot harder, and also dive deep into that combo system. In harder difficulties, you really need to know how to leverage all of the mechanics, because there's certain enemies that just make it really difficult if you don't know how to pull off certain combinations. And the game is just a lot of fun, like you said. Anyone can play it, but people that are really into this genre can dive deep and get a lot more out of it than they're used to seeing in something like a Simpsons game, or a Final Fight or something like that. Really
Yeah,
cool
it reminded
experience.
me it reminded me more of like River City Girls with the
Yeah.
combos,
Yep.
upgrading your character, tons of replayability because of that. Like you're saying, it's that perfect match of pick up and play or go super deep and spend dozens and dozens of hours really upgrading all of your characters, and the online portion. I mean, when I
Yeah.
played
Drop
it,
in, drop out.
the Yeah, drop in, drop out was a huge feature, right? Anyway, it's just a phenomenal game. I think it was perfect for its time. It caught all of us older, you know, elder millennials at the right time.
Hmm.
It came about just before the Cowabunga collection. We've just got a lot of Turtles games that were great this year,
Yeah.
and this one, it really made me look at some of the older ones differently. I mean, I still love them; they're still precious to me, and I'm nostalgic about it. But I can see myself feeling nostalgic about Shredder's Revenge in the
Yeah.
future.
Yeah, really good game. Recommend it. It's on the list for a reason. If you didn't get a chance to play it, you gotta. It's worth the price of admission. That brings us to number 7, the superior Pokemon game that released this year, Pokemon Arceus, Legends Arceus. This is the I don't know, I mean, I guess it's the Pokemon spin-off game, right?
Yeah,
Where you essentially see Game Freak trying to completely reinvent what a Pokemon game can be. This introduces, a pseudo open world that is something deeper than the wild areas, but not quite as extensive as what we got in Scarlet and Violet. It's more akin to like a Monster Hunter, select your deployment zone, go out, explore for a bit, come back. Um, it had auto capture, a system that was woefully just a huge oversight, not including in Scarlet and Violet, that made capturing
huge.
Pokemon for things like breeding or completing your Pokedex and stuff much simpler, more enjoyable. Shiny hunting was a dream in that game.
And more
Um,
natural.
yeah, and
It just felt much more natural.
what was cool about the game was it was a Pokemon game that could play like a Pokemon game. You could send out Pokemon, do traditional style battles, or you had, auto capture and the boss battles and, different systems that allowed you to really explore the Pokemon world and learn about the lore of these regions in ways that we'd never seen before. Some really cool returning Pokemon, some new designs that I thought were really enjoyable.
Mixing starters, like that was a
Yes,
huge one.
yeah, having stars
Starters
from
from
different
different gens.
generations, which was really cool. I just really, really enjoyed being able to go back and pick my best boy Rowlet again. That for me was the big draw, and then being able to go out and explore these vast open areas with, the legendary mounts and stuff that you got later on, the different climbing mechanics and stuff. It was a really cool, solid Pokemon game, and I loved the the older aesthetic that the game went with, right? Like the Meiji era Japan style aesthetic that was kind of running throughout the game that I thought was really cool.
Yeah, that
Why
plus
did this? Go ahead.
that plus the watercolor art, right? Like that really sold it for me too. Yeah.
Yeah. So as far as this game goes, for you, why is this, above Scarlet and Violet? What did it do better? Because it wasn't. I mean, it didn't run great. It ran well. It played fine. Definitely better than Scarlet and Violet. But what else about this game kind of resonated with you?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it mainly has to do with the Pokemon that were there, like the returning Pokemon. It was just
Hmm.
sort of like fan service for me that I appreciated. It's been hugely controversial that Game Freak has excluded Pokemon from newer games, based
Yeah.
on storage limitations of cartridges, that sort of thing. This game felt like it was intentionally mixing some older generations in a, I don't know, constructive way that made it feel like it wasn't a big deal that every single Pokemon wasn't there because, oh, I've got a few from Gen 2, I've got a few from Gen 4. And I don't know, it just felt like an interesting mix. So I appreciated that. I appreciated the aesthetic that you were talking about earlier. But more than that, these open zones were gigantic. Like they
Yeah.
felt like little worlds. I just wish that they had merged. But I think if you compare them to the open world that we got in Scarlet and Violet, the smaller zones in Arceus were more interesting. They
Yeah.
were they had more depth to them. They
They
had
felt more designed.
more design. They had more
Yeah.
verticality. The Pokemon, I think, were more interestingly placed. yeah, I just thought maybe it was because it was a smaller area. It's easier to focus in and figure out what should be there and what shouldn't be there. Lots
Hmm.
of Scarlet and Violet felt like big blank canvas. You know what I mean?
Yeah. 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 I think it just felt like a tighter, more well constructed Pokemon game than Scarlet and Violet. Whereas Scarlet and Violet maybe took some bigger swings and fell short as a result. Arceus felt like it was also trying to shake up the formula, and most of the stuff it tried to do landed better, in my opinion. That's really all I have to say about it. I think I enjoyed it a bit more than Scarlet and Violet, and as a result, right, of also having a more stable gameplay experience, it just ends up higher on the list as by default. And that's
Yep.
going to bring us to number 6. And so you've not got much to say about this game. You haven't played it yet. I fought real hard to get this on the list somewhere relatively high. So this is a me pick. This is sort of a vanity pick here, and this is Citizen Sleeper, a game that came out of nowhere at the beginning of the year that I played through multiple times back to back when it first released. And that takes some of my favorite things about gaming and really just kind of, you know, feels curated for me as a gamer. It pulls from tabletop RPG history. It's built off of primarily a system known as Blades in the Dark. For tabletop gamers out there, you're probably familiar with Blades in the Dark, a very famous, popular TTRPG system. And it takes place on a space station. The main mechanic of the game is you are what is known as a sleeper, which is an android or non-human body that has a human personality consciousness uploaded to it that is meant to work for a corporation until it dies. And you have gone rogue and you are attempting to find a new home on a derelict space station while also keeping your body from deteriorating. The game gives you 5 dice at the start of a day. You roll the dice and you play those dice throughout a map of a very sort of vertical horizontal map of a space station that allows you to look for food, do work, interact with people, all constrained by the use of these dice that you roll. Higher dice result in better, more effective outcomes. Lower dice rolls can result in terrible side effects and problems for your character. And so you end up unraveling this really deep narrative about what it means to find a home, to be a person, right, just to exist in a world that is antagonistic towards you, where resources are finite, right, and the next day is never guaranteed. And it explores some really interesting philosophical, social, and economic issues that I think are valuable for anyone who's interested in anything beyond video games. It does a lot that many games try to do much better. It tells a narrative that I think is something that everyone should experience. I can't speak highly enough about this game. It's one of the few games that I felt absolutely compelled to write a review for because I wanted to push as many people as I could towards it. It's a short experience, it's a cheap experience, and it's an absolutely, slam dunk if you're into cyberpunk, sci-fi, tabletop RPGs, narrative games, whatever. It's worth playing. And over the course of the year, they've released a handful of additional free DLCs with new characters and narratives and stuff to unravel. So it's worth coming back to if you played at the beginning of the year and haven't touched it in 5 or 6 months. So again, Justin, I know you've not played it. You don't have a lot to say about it, so I'm not going to force you to come in on this one. But I just want to say, if you haven't checked it out, please, if you've anything I've said about it, sounds interesting to you, you need to get on that Citizen Sleeper train. It is absolutely worth your time.
And Matthew fought very hard for this one and to end up at the number 6 spot with all these other great games above it. So I think it's definitely worth taking a look at. And Matthew's got his full review on nintendowatcher.com.
Yeah, please check it
That'll
out.
take us, yeah, check it out. That'll take us to number 5, a game I think that is near and dear to both of us.
Yes.
That's Triangle Strategy, another great game from Team Asano.
Yeah. A tactical RPG in the vein of Final Fantasy Tactics or Tactics Ogre. HD 2D, which you and I both are fans of, and comes from Team Asano. Again, Octopath Traveler, very near and dear to me, divisive amongst many fans of JRPGs, but regardless, I think Triangle Strategy does some really cool things with the branching narrative system and choice that a lot of tactics RPGs want to do but don't do well. It's got some cool characters and recruitable companions that I really enjoyed, a lot of depth for strategy, and pretty challenging battles, plus multiple
Yeah.
endings. So if you want to go through it and check it out, and kind of see what it's all about. I mean, we've done a full episode on this, so I don't want to cover too much here. Go back and listen to our episode on Triangle Strategy. But again, in a year of great RPGs, this one really stood out as just another experience that I kind of breezed through. What are your thoughts on it? Just, I know you liked it quite a bit, but do you have anything in particular that stands out?
Yeah, I really liked it a lot. It does the thing that pretty much every tactics game does, where it's multiple kingdoms battling for resources, and it's as much of a political game as it is a
Hmm.
an actual combat game, which I appreciated. But I think the reason this game sticks with me, and the reason why it had to be in the top 5 for me this year, is because of where and when I played it.
Yeah.
And this is a testament to the Switch. I was flying back and forth from a wedding in California earlier this year, and on the flight, I had several hours to kill, and Triangle Strategy was the perfect way to kill that time.
Yeah.
The gameplay loop was long enough. Some of those battles took quite a while.
Yeah.
It was long enough. It was interesting enough that it kept me engaged. And I think back on it, and I really appreciated that time that I had to really just focus in on that game and not do anything else but play. There's some issues I have with it towards the end. We talked about this in our full podcast on it, but towards the end, some of the past kind of goes some weird directions that you don't
Hmm.
expect, that the narrative doesn't really set up for. But before that, there are so many opportunities to make choices in this game. Some tactics games give you a handful of choices to make that really outline exactly where you're going to go, and you can kind of see, like, okay, if I make this choice, I'm going to end up going this way. If I make this choice, I'm going to go the other way. I felt like Triangle Strategy had hundreds of questions and hundreds of interactions that you could or could not make throughout the
Yeah.
game. And in some cases, you knew where they're going to land, but in a lot of situations, you didn't. And you
Yeah.
were just making like gut decisions that may or may not work out for you.
Yeah, I think that was the big thing for me, is that you didn't really know how your actions would play out until the next battle. And sometimes it was, like you said, very unpredictable. But I never felt dissatisfied with the outcomes. I let the dice roll. I didn't stay scum, right? I just kind of went with what I could do. There were a few opportunities where late in the game I tried to work towards a particular route, but for the most part, I just kind of let things happen and found the game to be quite enjoyable. No complaints from me. Yeah, I mean, again, if you like tactical RPGs, it's one of the better ones that came out this year and absolutely deserves a place in the top 10. And that brings us to a kind of tricky entry. Again, this is a game that I think fans of the series understand its placement this high in the list. People that have never really meshed with this particular series might quibble, but I'm putting Monster Hunter Sunbreak, an expansion to last year's Monster Hunter Rise, at number 4 on the Nintendo Watcher Game of the Year list. This was my third most played game of the year. I put in something in the range of 70 hours into the expansion to Monster Hunter Rise, a game I had already sunk 80 plus hours into the year before. It is a fully fledged game in its own right. It is a massive expansion, a brand new environment with dozens of new creatures to fight, with all the free updates that keep getting added to it. If you've played Monster Hunter before, you know that the joy of the game is just more creatures to kill, more armor to craft, more weapons to attain. And this game brings us the hardest hunts in the series in some of these cases. it fixes a major complaint of Rise, which was that it was just too easy. Right, a lot of the battles in Rise really felt too simplistic, too easy, and then Sunbreak comes in and kicks your teeth in. It is a hard as nails Monster Hunter game. For fans of the series, I think it really fixed a lot of what people were upset about with Rise, and for fans of Rise, it still continued to be more of that. It's a great game that has dozens and dozens of hours of content for a relatively fair price. I think it's like $40 for the expansion, which again, I think it has as much or more content than most full size games. And if you've never played a Monster Hunter before, yes, you should start with Rise, not with Sunbreak, but you can buy them as a bundle and go right through from one to the other and have yourself 200 hours worth of gameplay for $60. Worth the time, worth the money. Justin, I know you didn't really play it, but any thoughts on its placement here on the list?
Yeah, I didn't play Sunbreak. Monster Hunter Rise didn't really click for me. Like it would for 10 hours or so, and then
Hmm.
I'd get out of it. It just wasn't the game for me. But I remember you saying when you got it, we were talking about it, just texting back and forth, and you go, it feels like a sequel.
Yeah.
Doesn't feel like DLC. And I think there's something important there, and that's why it's on the list so high.
Hmm.
Lots of DLC just feels like developers are adding in stuff at the last minute or adding in things that should have been in the base game but didn't
Yeah.
make it. From what I've heard about this game from you, it really felt like this was truly an extension. You've got Monster Hunter Rise as the base game, and then if you want more, if you want tougher battles, if you want more weapons, if you want more stuff to do, this is another almost like a total sequel to the game that doesn't necessarily move the story forward or move the franchise forward, but it just gives you more of the same that you had from the base game. And I thought that was a huge reason why we had to include it, even though it's truly DLC.
Yeah. And again, I think it fits the bill. I think it works for the fans of the series, and I do think it deserves a spot in the top 5. So that's gonna bring us to number 3, another pick that rated very well, but maybe controversial for some decisions. Bayonetta 3. This is a game that I am a huge fan of, a series that I think, and I've been on record as saying, rivals that of the Devil May Cry series as far as third person action games go. It's a wonderful, rich, deep, complex combo system with a whole bunch of different weapon loadouts and new mechanics. Bayonetta 3 takes what makes the first two games well, which is fluid, crisp, grade A combat, and adds in some new mechanics like controlling giant demon monsters, big fun set pieces full of chaotic, just nonsense, and kind of just turns the dial up to 11. It's got a time travel narrative. It's got multiple universes and dimensions and stuff where you meet like 16 different Bayonettas throughout the series. It does some really controversial stuff in the end game that I was not particularly a fan of. I thought it did the main character a little dirty in the end, but as a gameplay experience, this is another one where I just kind of sat down, started playing it on a Friday, finished it on a Sunday, and loved every second of it. It plays very well. It's, again, if you like games like Devil May Cry or the Ninja Gaiden series, or even something like a God of War, Bayonetta scratches that itch in a genre that I felt has been a little lacking of late. And to me, the fact that we even have another Bayonetta, a series that has largely undersold and underperformed for Nintendo and Platinum Games, just speaks to the quality of the product. Even though it doesn't sell super well, it's not a critical darling, it has a dedicated and powerful fan base singing its praises, and it's got a developer that really cares about it. And so I just thought it was, again, one of those experiences where I, aside from some story issues, I can't fault any of the gameplay. I can't fault any of the mechanics. I can't fault any of the, if you like collectathons, it's got plenty of that in there. If you like finding, secrets within levels, it's got plenty of that. If you like speed running, you can do that. There's even systems in it to encourage you to get through levels super fast and to find, hidden areas and alcoves and secrets and play through challenge missions and, arenas and stuff like that. It's great. It's a wonderful experience. It's got some cool secondary and tertiary characters that you can play as and interact with. Just an all around great experience. And aesthetically, it's just a wildly interesting series.
And it adds some great diversity to our list. And
Yes,
an action game, really. I don't know if I want to call it an action platformer, but
kind of. Yeah,
action game.
yeah. We don't. The closest thing on the list is Shredder's Revenge, and that's not, those aren't super comparable. But I do
Yeah,
think that it's cool to see that, there's a lot of variety on what came out this year for the Switch. We got a lot of really good games and a lot of varieties of genres. One of the biggest being our number 2 pick, Splatoon 3. Again, I've talked ad nauseum about Splatoon. People know that I am. I've got, I think, behind me on the shelf here. I don't know if you can see it. I have every Splatoon amiibo ever released, with the exception of the purple Inkling. I've got them all back there on the shelf. I love it. Series is one of my favorites. I think as a competitive multiplayer shooter, is more interesting to me than anything like, Overwatch or Fortnite or, all those kinds of games, because I like the idea that anyone can be competitive in it. Anyone can contribute if they've never played a game like this. It's accessible to new players, young players, old players, and serious players. They've got really good options for competitive play, for casual play. Aesthetically, it's really fun. The music is top notch. The gameplay is unique and something that we don't see in a lot of games. And if I understand correctly, Justin, it's the first game in the series that kind of made you a fan.
yeah. I was a fan of Splatoon 2, but I didn't really get on with the online portion of it.
Mm-hmm.
Like I got on it a little too late, and I felt like I couldn't catch up. But Splatoon 3 really hooked me. It sort of did the Smash Brothers thing where anybody can pick up and play it. But if you're willing to spend time and really learn how to play the game, you can be elite. And, you know, uh, this almost could have been my number one pick had
Yeah.
it not been for the online issues with the game.
Yeah.
With matchmaking, you know, rounds closing and, before they finish, that really bummed me out this year, uh, from what otherwise is a really fantastic third
Mm.
person shooter. I love it. It's great for all ages. It's a shooter, but it's not violent. The matches are quick, so you're in and out. The gameplay loop is really fast. This is that game, and there's always games like this every year, but this was the top game for me this year that was just the one more go,
Yeah.
one more round, one more go, one more round. And then you're sitting there for 3 hours and you don't know where your time went.
Yeah.
But that was the only game I remember this year that really had me hooked like that. I just
Mm-hmm.
had to keep going.
Yeah. It had a really good single player story as well, which I don't want to go too much into that. We've talked about it prior, but if you like single player, it even is worth it for just the single player. If you don't like the multiplayer, it's got a really long, 8-10 hour story. That's fun. It's a cool set of, mini challenge levels and stages, which I think was really enjoyable. And then, at the end of the day, I really love the fact that Splatoon is a series from Nintendo that has really embraced the keep giving the player more mentality, right? They adopted a seasonal, gameplay loop. Every 3 months a new season comes out with a catalog full of new rewards to gain, with new weapons, new levels, new gameplay modes, and things like that. And those are going to continue, as far as we can tell, for the foreseeable future. So it's a game that's going to keep a vibrant community alive. You'll be able to jump in and find games. You can still find games in the first and second Splatoon games from all the way back in the Wii U, to the early Switch days. So it's not going anywhere. If you like anything that you've heard about the game, check it out. It's a great series, and one that, down the road, is probably only going to continue to grow as one of the staple, Nintendo franchises. I think this is going to be up there with, your Mario's, your Zeldas, and your Donkey Kongs in the future. In fact, I think it's already, you know clearly they care more about Splatoon these days than some of their lesser franchises, or even some of their old favorites like Metroid and Donkey Kong. We're not seeing a whole lot of those these days, and I feel like we're going to keep seeing a lot of Splatoon. So check it out. I mean, I think it's absolutely. I again could have been number one if it hadn't been for number one on the list. Which, Justin, I'm going to let you take the reins on this one, because this is a game that I know you found, really, really, top notch this year. We agreed this was the one item on the list, the one game on the list. Well, Splatoon 3, we pretty much both came in the top three on that, but Xenoblade Chronicles 3 was our unanimous number one pick for this year. Both of us completed the game. Both of us spent, I think, triple digit hours in the game or close to it. So why is this the Nintendo Watcher, besides being a JRPG? Sorry, you knew it was going to happen. But besides that,
Yep.
why is Xenoblade Chronicles 3 the Nintendo Watcher 2022 Game of the Year?
This is such a huge game, such a multifaceted game. It could not be. This game does everything that Xenoblade 1, Xenoblade 2 did, but better. Maybe the story is not as good as 1, but the gameplay is so much tighter.
Mm-hmm.
It, it's hard to even say what like exactly made this game so powerful, but the narrative is really powerful. The connections between Xenoblade 1, 2, and 3 felt really satisfying to me.
Mm-hmm.
Seeing old characters, seeing sort of like descendants of old characters really hit me pretty hard. I played all three Xenoblades again this year and completed all three this year. So I think that probably helped solidify this as number one for me. But I think ultimately for me, it was the ability to switch characters and get the best of Xenoblade 1 or Xenoblade 2.
Mm-hmm.
In combat, different characters on your team build up their specials and their arts differently based on the sort of philosophy of combat from either Xenoblade 1 or Xenoblade 2. And I've always been a bigger fan of Xenoblade 2's combat. So I could just play with those
Yeah.
characters and really get a really fulfilling experience for me. Where if somebody else really liked the first Xenoblade's combat better, they could play with those characters and get a totally different experience. Xenoblade 3, I mean, the combat's one thing, but the world is probably the other biggest contributor for this being number one for me. This was a gigantic open world that felt alive.
Yeah. Yeah. Other than Elden Ring, right? A game not in our list for obvious reasons. I don't think a game has done an open world better this year or in recent memory than Xenoblade Chronicles 3. The world is huge, the world is
Agreed.
diverse, it is full of secrets and enjoyable experiences to uncover. The soundtrack and gameplay and moment to moment experience of the game is really it's a slow start. I'll say it's a slow burn at first. It takes a while to get into. I think, as with a lot of RPGs, you're running into this issue where you're telling non JRPG players just give it 5 to 10 hours, and that's not an easy ask. That's not a fair ask, and it's totally understandable if players bounce off of it in the first 5 hours and decide this isn't for me. But I do think that if you hit that 10-hour mark or so, things click. Once you get both sides of your party, you fill out the full arena, you start getting character classes that you can unlock, you start unwrapping like the full use of your special powers, right? Your Mobius powers and stuff like that. You begin to see that the gameplay systems allows for a lot of variety and experimentation that makes moment to moment gameplay and combat encounters much more enjoyable. Early encounters feel like a slog. They take ages to complete. Then you unlock fusion abilities and you unlock the ability to do combos and to create these, big, huge link attacks that end up wiping the floor with enemies like that. And yes, they still take a long time, but they take much less time than they did at the beginning. And the gameplay starts to feel a little smoother. The second to second loop feels better. The overall experience just kind of evens out to the point where you can just kind of enjoy the phenomenally written side quests, which are some of the best in the genre,
They
or
don't
any
even feel like
genre.
side quests.
They feel crucial to the story. You learn about tertiary characters that you otherwise wouldn't. You find out more about your own party members and their likes, dislikes, loves and hates and all of that. You get to experience the world in a way that is very enlightening if you've played the first two games, and you learn a whole lot more about those worlds as a result. It's just overall a very well paced, very well designed, and expertly implemented video game. In fact, it's also a game that, by all accounts, should not run as well as it does on the Switch. Again, I keep coming back to this because it was in the discourse all year that the Switch is on its last legs. And then a game like Xenoblade Chronicles 3 comes out. And if that were true, this game should run terribly. It doesn't. It runs amazingly. It's very well optimized. The draw distance is great. Yes, there's some popping. Yes, there's some weird, tricks they have to do to make it work by making it so the grass doesn't load in around your character's feet within a certain radius and stuff like that. But that doesn't detract from the experience, doesn't pull away from the fact that this is a technological and gameplay marvel for 2022, and easily my favorite JRPG experience of the year, of the last several years. Right? Again, I said that of the Persona games, Persona 5 is tops. This is, to me, this is better. This is a more enjoyable experience overall. There's a reason it's number one on the list for me. Any final comments on our Nintendo Watcher Game of the Year before we move on to our final little segment?
I just couldn't agree with you more about the pacing of this game. It's a 100-hour game that feels like you're playing it for like 20 hours.
Yeah, yeah,
It once you get past that initial slow period, you're right. It really picks up fast. And this is a game that I already feel nostalgic about. Like,
yeah,
I'm thinking back to playing it over the summer, and I'm like, man, that was a really good time. Just thinking about everything else that was going on in my life at the time, and how I was fitting this game into my everyday life, picking up here and there because of the Switch being a hybrid, like we were talking about earlier. Yeah, it's such a powerful game. I think the art style grew up a lot
yes,
between Xenoblade 2 and 3,
yes,
and I think it's important to make a note of that for people who are turned off by 2. The only downside to this game is I feel like you really can't appreciate it unless you've played 1 and 2. Like, you can play it and get a satisfactory experience from it, but it's such a richer experience having the knowledge of both Xenoblade 1 and 2. And I think that's really the only drawback I have about the
yeah.
game.
And I'm gonna, as a counterpoint, I'm gonna say yes, it's a richer experience, but I think that Xenoblade Chronicles 3 is a wonderful, fantastic standalone experience. And if you don't play the first two, you will still enjoy it. Right? You'll
Yeah.
miss out on stuff, but I don't think it's stuff that's incomprehensible. I only think it's stuff that is satisfying to people that have played 1 and 2. It's not like the experience where you haven't played it, you won't understand it, right? And I think that's a really crucial distinction.